Tony leaned against the doorframe of the classroom, a fond smile tugging at his lips as he watched the students tackle another glitter-filled art project. He loved his job. Well, most days. Today was one of those most days. But his peace was about to be shattered. "Mr. Tony, look at mine!" Tony crouched down to admire the art piece from Sophia, the ball of sunshine who always seemed to light up the room. "Sophia, I think this might belong in a museum," he teased. Sophia giggled. "I told Daddy you said I'm super smart. He wants to meet you." Tony blinked, caught off guard. "Your dad? Oh well, tell him I'm flattered." Sophia beamed. "He's coming today. He said he wants to see the man who thinks I'm the best." Tony's heart skipped a bit. He knew who her dad was. He was known as the most dangerous Italian mafia, but he tried to brush it off as a parent's casual interest. When dismissal time rolled around, Tony was packing up when the air in the room seemed to shift. The loud chatter of parents waiting outside hushed, and Tony looked up to see why. Walking into the nursery was a man who seemed to have stepped out of a movie. Luigi Ferraro, the very definition of dangerously handsome. He was tall, with broad shoulders, a sharply tailored black suit, and an air of authority that seemed to freeze everyone in their tracks. After all, he was known by everyone to be the most dangerous Italian mafia. His dark eyes scanned the room before landing on Tony. "Tony, right?" Luigi's voice was smooth. Tony swallowed hard but stood his ground, trying to hide his uneasiness. After all, he was standing close to someone who could probably snap his neck without breaking a sweat. "That's me. And you must be Sophia's dad." Luigi's lips curved into a smile. "She talks about you constantly. Says you're her favorite." Tony glanced at Sophia, who was looking far too pleased with herself. "Well, she's a good kid. Makes my job easy." Luigi stepped closer, towering over Tony, but not invading his space. "I'm impressed by the way you care for her. So impressed that I have a proposal for you." Tony blinked. "A proposal? I want you to come work for me. Full-time, as Sophia's nanny. At my house." Tony breath caught. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for a change." Luigi's expression didn't falter, though his gaze sharpened slightly. "Think it over. Sophia needs stability, and I'm offering you an opportunity most people wouldn't refuse." Tony crossed his arms, trying not to shrink under the weight of Luigi's presence. "I'm sure you're used to getting your way, but I'm not most people." He immediately regretted it as soon as the words left his mouth. For a second, silence stretched between them before Luigi let out a low chuckle that sounded both amused and dangerous. "I like you already." With that, he turned to leave, holding out a hand for Sophia, who took it with a giggle. Before they walked out the door, Luigi glanced back. "I'll see you soon, Tony." As soon as they were gone, Tony let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered. The other teachers whispered around him, speculating about what the intimidating mafia might want. The next few days passed with Tony convincing himself that Luigi Ferraro would lose interest. Surely a man as important as that couldn't have the time for a lowly nursery teacher. But Tony underestimated the persistence of an Italian mafia leader. It started with flowers delivered to the school's front desk with a note that said, "For the man who makes my daughter smile." Tony rolled his eyes and tossed the note into the trash, ignoring the teasing from his coworkers. Then came the extravagant lunches. One afternoon, as Tony sat with his usual homemade sandwich, a black-suited man appeared at the door carrying a gourmet picnic basket. "Delivery from Mr. Ferraro," the man said. Tony stared at the basket, which was filled with imported cheeses, fresh bread, and even a bottle of wine, which he doubted was legal to bring into a school. He sighed, shoving it aside. "Tell Mr. Ferraro I'm fine with my P-Banjay, thanks," he muttered, trying not to sound as flustered as he felt. The final straw came one Friday afternoon. As the children were being picked up, a familiar black car pulled up, and Luigi stepped out, as intimidating as ever. He leaned against the vehicle as Sophia skipped over to hug him. Tony stayed back, hoping Luigi would simply take Sophia and leave. No such luck. "Tony." Luigi's deep voice carried across the playground, making more than a few parents glance over nervously. Tony straightened, plastering on his best unimpressed expression. "Mr. Ferraro, I've been very patient. Now I think it's time we had a serious conversation." "Serious, huh?" Tony shot back. "Does this conversation involve you understanding the word no?" Luigi chuckled, a low, rich sound that somehow made Tony's cheeks heat up. "You're stubborn. I like that." Luigi gestured for Sophia to wait by the car, then walked toward Tony. As he approached, Tony realized just how much taller Luigi was, a fact he tried to ignore but couldn't. Luigi stopped mere inches away, his presence overwhelming. "You've been good to my daughter," Luigi said, his tone softening slightly. "She adores you. I want her to have the best, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen. And what if I don't want to work for you? Ever think of that? Luigi leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I think you're a smart man. Smart enough to know that saying yes would make your life a lot easier. Tony didn't doubt for a second that Luigi Ferraro could make things very difficult if he wanted to. But Tony also wasn't about to be bullied into submission. Thanks for the offer, but I'll pass, Tony said, forcing a smirk. And if you're going to keep bribing me, at least send chocolate next time. Luigi blinked, then laughed a genuine, deep laugh that seemed to catch even him off guard. He stepped back, holding his hands up in mock surrender. You're impossible, Luigi said, shaking his head. But fine, have it your way for now. Tony watched as Luigi walked back to the car, helped Sophia into her seat, and drove off. As the car disappeared down the street, Tony let out a long breath, his heart racing. Why does he have to be so annoying? Tony muttered to himself. That day, Tony sat in his tiny one-bedroom apartment. His bills were spread across the kitchen table, each one screaming for attention he couldn't afford to give. The truth was, as much as Tony loved his job, working as a nursery teacher didn't exactly pay well. Rent was due, and his savings were nearly gone. Tony leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He hated the idea of accepting Luigi Ferraro's offer. It felt too much like surrendering. But what choice did he have? A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. He frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 9 at night. Opening the door, Tony was surprised to find Luigi standing there, looking effortlessly put together despite the hour. He held a bottle of wine in one hand and a confident smirk on his face. Mr. Ferraro, Tony said, with surprise written on his face. Are you stalking me now? Luigi chuckled, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Stalking is such an ugly word. Let's call it me being persistent. Tony rolled his eyes, but didn't stop him. Luigi glanced around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the peeling wallpaper and the cracked ceiling. You live here? Luigi asked, his tone neutral, but his raised eyebrow betraying his judgment. Tony frowned. Yes, I live here. Not all of us can afford luxury mansions, you know. Luigi sighed. This place doesn't suit you. You deserve better. Well, unless you're here to fix the leaky faucet, I don't see how that's your business. Tony shot back, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Luigi turned to face him, his expression softening slightly. Tony, I mean it. Come work for me. Live at my house. You'll have everything you need, and Sophia will be happier for it. Tony stared at him, torn. Every instinct screamed at him to say no, to keep his independence, to avoid getting tangled in whatever web Luigi Ferraro spun. But then he thought about his bank account, about his unpaid bills, about how much easier it would be to live without worrying about whether he could afford groceries. Fine, Tony said abruptly, surprising even himself. Luigi's smirk widened. Fine, I'll do it, Tony clarified. I'll work for you, but let's get a few things straight. He stepped closer. 1. I'm not going to be your personal servant. I'm there for Sophia, not you. 2. I expect to be treated like a professional, not some charity case. And 3. If you even think about trying to boss me around outside of nanny duties, I'm out. Got it? Luigi's eyes gleamed with amusement. Got it? And don't look so smug, Tony added. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I don't have a choice. Of course, Luigi said smoothly. Tony sighed, already regretting his decision. I'll start Monday. And don't think for a second this means I'm impressed by you or your stupid suits. Luigi laughed, a warm, deep sound that sent a shiver down Tony's spine. I wouldn't dream of it. As Luigi left, Tony closed the door behind him, leaning against it with a groan. What have I gotten myself into, he muttered. Monday morning arrived faster than Tony anticipated, and a sleek black car came to pick him up. When they pulled up to the Ferraro estate, a mansion with immaculate gardens and a fountain big enough to swim in, Tony couldn't help but gape. Don't let it intimidate you, the driver said with a smirk as he opened Tony's door. It's just a house, with too many rooms. Tony stepped out, still trying to process the sheer size of the place. The house was as extravagant as Tony expected. Luigi greeted him at the entrance, looking annoyingly perfect. You made it, Luigi said. Come on, I'll show you to your room. Luigi led him to a cozy yet luxurious guest suite and left him to settle in. Once Tony unpacked, he decided to explore the kitchen in search of coffee. The kitchen was bustling with activity. Chefs darted around, preparing what appeared to be a feast. One of the cooks, a handsome man with dark hair, noticed Tony first. Well, he drawled, leaning against the counter. You must be the famous Mr. Tony. I can see why the boss is so interested. Tony raised an eyebrow. And you are? Enzo, the man replied, extending a hand. Head chef. And, if I may say, I make a killer tiramisu. Perhaps I'll make one just for you. Tony snorted. Flirting won't get you a better review from me. Enzo's grin widened. Flirting gets me everywhere. Another chef joined in. Ignore Enzo. He thinks he's irresistible. But if you're looking for someone to show you around, I'd be happy to volunteer. Tony opened his mouth to respond, but a low voice interrupted from behind him. That won't be necessary. Tony turned to see Luigi, standing in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on the two chefs. Enzo, Matteo, don't you two have work to do? Luigi asked, his tone dangerously calm. Both men quickly returned to their tasks, though Enzo winked at Tony before turning away. Luigi stepped closer, his presence filling the room. I see you're making friends already. Tony sighed. Mr. Ferraro, it's harmless. Luigi's jaw tightened. They should focus on their jobs, not on you. Tony folded his arms. Maybe you should let me handle my own interactions. Luigi stepped even closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Tony could hear. You're here to take care of Sophia, not to entertain my staff. If anyone's going to flirt with you, it'll be me. Tony's eyes widened, heat rushing to his face. Excuse me? Luigi smirked, leaning in just slightly. You heard me. Tony took a step back, trying to regain his composure. Okay, this is exactly what I meant about boundaries. You can't just— Luigi cut him off with a wave of his hand. Boundaries are for people who don't know what they want. Tony stared at him, stunned. Before he could muster a response, Luigi turned and left, making it clear he had no intention of continuing the discussion. Tony groaned, running a hand through his hair. This is going to be a nightmare, he muttered. Behind him, Enzo glanced over with a knowing grin. Good luck, Mr. Tony. You're going to need it. Tony's first official day on the job began with breakfast. He was seated at the long dining table, feeling oddly out of place. Sophia sat beside him, chatting about her favorite toys, books, and of course her daddy. I told Daddy that you'd come, Sophia said triumphantly. He said you'd say no, but I knew you wouldn't. Tony chuckled, spreading butter on a piece of toast. Did you now? Sophia nodded confidently. You're too nice to say no, and Daddy always listens to me. Tony smiled at her. You've got him wrapped around your little finger? Huh? Sophia giggled. Daddy says I'm his princess. Tony glanced at Luigi, who was sipping his coffee and watching them with an unreadable expression. The man hadn't said much since breakfast started, but his eyes lingered on Tony more than was necessary. So, Mr. Ferraro, Tony said, trying to break the tension. Are you always this talkative? Or is it just me? Luigi smirked, setting his cup down. I'm enjoying the show. You're good with her. It's my job, Tony replied, trying to sound casual. No, Luigi said, his voice softer. It's more than that. Tony felt a flicker of warmth at the compliment, but quickly pushed it aside. He turned back to Sophia, who was already planning their day. After breakfast, Tony spent the morning with Sophia in the playroom, which was larger than his entire apartment. Mr. Tony, can you be the prince? Sophia asked, handing him a plastic tiara. Tony hesitated, glancing at the tiny crown. You want me to wear this? Sophia nodded eagerly. You have to save me from the dragon. With a sigh, Tony placed the tiara on his head. All right, but only because you asked nicely. They spent the next hour acting out an elaborate fairy tale, complete with Tony pretending to battle an invisible dragon and Sophia insisting he bow to her as queen of the kingdom. From the doorway, Luigi watched silently, a rare smile tugging at his lips. After putting Sophia down for a nap, Tony headed to the library, where he could catch his breath. He sank into a plush armchair, closing his eyes for a moment. Escaping already? Tony opened his eyes to find Luigi standing by the doorway. Do you sneak up on people for fun? Or is this a mafia thing? Tony asked, sitting up straighter. Luigi chuckled, stepping inside. It's a me thing. Tony rolled his eyes. Well, if you're here to say something annoying, save it. I'm off duty for the next hour. Luigi dark eyes fixed on Tony. I don't think you're ever off duty. You're too dedicated. Tony frowned, unsure if that was meant as a compliment or not. I told you, I'm here for Sophia. Nothing else. Luigi took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly. You're not just good at your job. You care about her. That's rare. Tony stood, putting space between them. All right, we need to talk about these boundaries again. Luigi smirked, closing the distance Tony had created. And I'm going to dismiss it again. Tony glared at him. You can't just— I can, Luigi interrupted, his voice calm but firm. This is my house, Tony. My rules. And whether you like it or not, you're part of this family now. Tony's breath caught. The way Luigi said family sounded both protective and possessive, and it left him feeling more vulnerable than he wanted to admit. I'm here for Sophia, Tony repeated, his voice quieter this time. Luigi reached out, his fingers brushing against Tony's wrist. I know, but that doesn't mean I can't care about you too. Tony pulled his hand away, his heart racing. Stop doing that. Doing what? Luigi asked, his smirk returning. Whatever it is you're trying to do, Tony said, his voice unsteady. You can't just say things like that. Luigi didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back, giving Tony space. You should rest. Sophia will want your full attention when she wakes up. And just like that, he was gone, leaving Tony alone in the library, his mind spinning. What the hell is wrong with him? Tony muttered, flustered. It was afternoon when Tony found himself back in the kitchen. Sophia was playing with her dolls, giving him a brief moment of peace. He figured he'd grab a snack before she demanded his attention again. Enzo and Matteo were there, chatting as they prepared lunch. When they noticed Tony, both men lit up like Christmas trees. Well, look who's back, Enzo said, wiping his hands on a towel. Tony rolled his eyes, reaching for a basket of fruit. Relax, Enzo. I'm just here for an apple. Matteo stepped closer, his smile easy. Why settle for an apple when I can make you something special? A cappuccino? Some tiramisu? I'm good, thanks, Tony said, but his voice softened. Matteo's sincerity was oddly charming. Enzo leaned against the counter, grinning. You know, Tony, it's a shame you're here for Sophia. If I had my way, I'd keep you here in the kitchen. Is that so? Tony replied, raising an eyebrow. Because I thought your job was cooking, not flirting with the staff. Matteo chuckled. You're sharp, Tony. I like that. Tony smirked, grabbing his apple. And I like it when people don't waste my time. The banter was light, playful, and just the distraction Tony needed. That was, until the air in the room shifted. A familiar presence loomed behind him, and Tony turned to find Luigi standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his dark eyes flicked between Enzo, Matteo, and Tony with a chilling intensity. Am I interrupting something? Luigi asked, his tone deceivingly calm. Enzo and Matteo froze, their earlier confidence evaporating. No, boss, Enzo said quickly, straightening up. We were just talking. Luigi's gaze settled on Tony. Talking? Tony swallowed, trying to keep his composure. Yes, Mr. Ferraro. Just talking. Luigi stepped closer, his movements slow. Enzo. Matteo, don't you both have work to do? Yes, boss, Matteo said, grabbing a cutting board and knife. Enzo followed suit. Once the two men were busy, Luigi turned his full attention to Tony. You seem to attract a lot of attention, Luigi said, his voice low. Tony crossed his arms, trying to sound braver than he felt. It's not my fault your staff are friendly. Friendly? Luigi took another step closer, the tension between them palpable. Friendly is one thing. Crossing lines is another. Tony exhaled sharply, setting the apple on the counter. All right, enough. We need to talk about this. Luigi raised an eyebrow. About what? This, Tony said, gesturing between them. You can't just keep hovering over me like some jealous boyfriend. I'm here to take care of Sophia, not to deal with whatever game you're playing. Luigi's smirk disappeared, replaced by something darker. Game? Yes, game, Tony said, his voice faltering slightly. I don't know what your deal is, but it's making my job harder. So whatever you're doing, stop. For a moment, Luigi said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Then, he stepped even closer, his presence suffocating. Do you know who you're talking to? Luigi asked, his voice dangerously soft. Tony's breath caught. He'd forgotten for a moment who Luigi Ferraro really was. The mafia leader. A man who likely didn't hear no very often, and certainly not from someone like Tony. I know exactly who you are, Tony stammered, taking a step back. Luigi's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. Do you? Because if you did, you'd think twice before telling me what to do in my own house. Tony's heart raced as he keeps taking steps back, only for Luigi to keep taking steps forward, fear clawing its way into his chest. I'm just trying to do my job, and I'm trying to protect what's mine, Luigi interrupted, his voice like steel. Tony's back hit the counter, and he realized there was nowhere else to go. I'm not yours, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Luigi's eyes softened slightly, but his intensity didn't waver. No, but you're under my roof, taking care of my daughter. That makes you my responsibility, and I don't take that lightly. Luigi stepped back, giving him room to breathe, but the tension lingered. Go check on Sophia, Luigi said, his tone firm but not unkind. We'll talk about this later. Tony didn't argue. He grabbed his apple and left the kitchen as quickly as he could, his heart still pounding. As he walked down the hall, he muttered to himself, what the hell have I gotten myself into? Tony couldn't shake the encounter in the kitchen. His mind replayed Luigi's words, his tone, and the way he'd closed the distance between them. It was like staring into the eyes of a predator. By the time he reached Sophia's playroom, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before stepping inside. "Mr. Tony!" Sophia ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "I missed you." Tony forced a smile, crouching down to her level. "Miss me? I was only gone for a few minutes." Sophia giggled, pulling him toward her tea set. "Come on, we're having a tea party, and you're the guest of honor." Tony let her lead him, grateful for the distraction. As he sat at the tiny table, holding an imaginary cup of tea, he reminded himself why he was here, for Sophia. Whatever complicated feelings or fears Luigi stirred in him, they didn't matter as long as Sophia was happy. Later that evening, Tony was in his room. He had barely started to relax when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, assuming it was Sophia. Instead, Luigi stepped inside, carrying a tray with plates of food and some fruits on it. Tony froze, his earlier fear bubbling to the surface. "You didn't come down for dinner," Luigi said simply, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I wasn't hungry." Tony lied, trying to sound nonchalant. Luigi gave him a pointed look. "You've been running around after Sophia all day. You need to eat." Tony stared at the tray, then at Luigi. "What's this? Some kind of peace offering?" Luigi's lips twitched into a small smile. "Call it whatever you want. Just eat." Tony hesitated before picking up the spoon, taking a bite. "It's good," Tony admitted. "I know," Luigi said, leaning against the doorframe. Tony shot him a look. "What? You made it yourself?" "No," Luigi replied, his smirk returning. "But I made sure the cook put extra effort into it." Tony rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his small smile. "Thanks, I guess." Luigi lingered for a moment, his expression softening. "If anything bothers you, anyone bothers you, you come to me. Understand?" Tony set the spoon down. "Why do you care so much?" Luigi didn't answer right away. He crossed the room, stopping just a few feet from Tony. "Because I trust you with the most important thing in my life. And I don't trust easily." Tony's breath hitched. The way Luigi looked at him, intense but not threatening, sent a shiver down his spine. "I'm just a nanny," Tony said softly, almost to himself. "You're more than that," Luigi replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Tony's heart pounded as Luigi turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Alone in his room, Tony was lost in thought. Luigi's kindness felt genuine, but what did Luigi expect from him? What if he made a mistake? Would the mafia boss's patience run out? "Get it together, Tony," he muttered to himself. "You're here for Sophia. That's it." The next morning, Tony woke up to the smell of coffee. When he made his way to the dining room, Sophia greeted him with her usual enthusiasm. "Mr. Tony, look, Daddy made breakfast." Tony blinked, looking at the table. The chefs were nowhere in sight, and Luigi stood by the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee while eggs, bacon, and toast sat on the table. "You made this?" Tony asked, his disbelief clear. Luigi shrugged. "Thought I'd help out for a change." Tony narrowed his eyes. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Luigi said, his smirk returning. "But don't get used to it." Tony couldn't help but laugh, the tension from the day before easing slightly. Tony's days at the Ferraro estate were slowly beginning to fall into a rhythm. Mornings were for Sophia's lessons, afternoons for play, and evenings. Well, evenings were unpredictable. It wasn't that Luigi was around all the time, but when he was, his presence was impossible to ignore. Tony always felt like he was being watched. Not in a threatening way, at least, not always, but in a way that made him hyper-aware of every move he made. One particularly quiet afternoon, Tony decided to explore the estate. Sophia had gone down for a nap, and with some rare free time on his hands, he figured he might as well get to know his surroundings. The house was enormous, so Tony wandered aimlessly, walking into random rooms and marveling at the sheer luxury of the place. He turned another corner and opened a door, expecting to find another empty room. Instead, he found Luigi. Luigi was seated in a leather chair, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a book in the other. Tony froze. "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to." Luigi looked up, his dark eyes softening when he saw who it was. "Tony, come in." Come in," Luigi repeated, his tone firm but somehow soft at the same time. Tony hesitated before stepping into the room. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just exploring." Luigi gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Tony raised an eyebrow, but obeyed. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, and Tony found himself relaxing despite his earlier hesitation. "You should explore more often," Luigi said suddenly, breaking the silence. Tony glanced at him. "Why's that?" "Because I like having you around." Tony's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly looked away, pretending to study the bookshelf. "Don't get used to it. I'm here for Sophia, remember?" Luigi leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I haven't forgotten. There was something in his tone, something that made Tony's stomach twist. He stood abruptly, needing to break the moment. Well, I should get back, Tony said, standing up. Sophia will wake up soon. Luigi didn't stop him, but his gaze lingered as Tony made his way to the door. Tony, Luigi called just as Tony was about to leave. Tony paused, his hand on the doorknob. Yeah, don't be afraid of me. Tony turned to look at him, his expression guarded. I'm not afraid of you. Luigi's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Good? Because you don't have to be. Tony was minding his own business, sitting on the sofa with Sophia as she braided his hair, when Luigi entered the room. Tony, Luigi called. Not now. I'm Sophia's personal mannequin, Tony replied without looking up. Luigi's lips quirked in amusement. I'm letting you know we have guests arriving soon. Guests? Tony asked, finally looking up. You mean like Mafia people? Luigi smirked. One of them is a business associate, Milo. The other is Sister Gina. Tony frowned. And why are you telling me? Because Gina tends to take an interest in me, Luigi said, his voice laced with annoyance. Tony snorted, amused by the idea of someone making the Luigi uncomfortable. Sounds like a you problem. Luigi stepped closer, his presence instantly making Tony feel smaller. Not when I plan to make it a you problem. Tony narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? You'll see, Luigi replied, his smirk deepening. Tony stood awkwardly by the couch as Milo and Gina entered the living room. Gina was stunning, with long, dark hair and a body-hugging dress. Milo, on the other hand, had a laid-back charm, his messy curls and easy smile making him look more like a flirt than a businessman. Luigi, Gina greeted, her voice soft and almost seductive. She walked up to Luigi, placing a hand on his arm. It's been far too long. Luigi's smile was polite but distant. Gina, Milo, welcome. Tony watched the interaction with amusement, but his amusement quickly faded when Gina's eyes landed on him. And who's this? Gina asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. This is Tony, Luigi said smoothly, his gaze flicking to Tony with a spark of something unreadable. Tony gave a small wave, feeling awkward under Gina's scrutinizing gaze. Hi. Gina tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk. Interesting. I didn't realize you had a house guest, Luigi. Luigi's smirk returned, and he placed a hand on Tony's shoulder, pulling him slightly closer. Tony is Sophia's nanny. Nanny, Gina repeated, her brow raising. Teacher by trade. Tony clarified, his tone a little defensive. Nanny by circumstance. Milo stepped forward, his grin widening. Well, Tony, it's a pleasure to meet you. I have a feeling we're going to get along just fine. Tony shot him a skeptical look. That's optimistic. Luigi chuckled at the response. Throughout the evening, Gina made her intentions toward Luigi obvious. She leaned in too close, and even brushed imaginary lint off his jacket. Tony watched from the sidelines, trying not to laugh at how uninterested Luigi looked. Luigi, you should come to the vineyard sometime, Gina suggested. We could share a bottle of our finest wine. Luigi's eyes flicked to Tony, a mischievous glint in them. I'm not much of a wine drinker, he said casually. But Tony here loves a good vintage. Tony choked on his drink. I do. Yes, Luigi said, his smirk growing. I'm sure Gina would love to show you around. Gina's smile faltered. I was talking about us, Luigi. Tony leaned back in his chair, hiding his smirk behind his glass. Meanwhile, Milo seemed determined to get Tony's attention. So, Tony, Milo began, sliding into the seat next to him. You know, if you ever want to change, I could use someone like you on my team. Tony tilted his head, pretending to consider it, before saying, Let me guess. You need someone to babysit your goldfish? Luigi barked out a laugh, quickly masking it with a cough. Something like that, Milo replied, undeterred. Tony rolled his eyes. I'll pass, thanks. That night, after Tony finally managed to get Sophia tucked into bed, he let out a relieved sigh as he closed the door to her room, happy to finally have some time to himself. He needed a shower, some peace, and some sleep. However, as he walked down the hallway, he heard voices from the living room. Milo and Gina had insisted on staying the night after their late meeting with Luigi. Tony made his way to the living room instead of his room. He didn't know why he didn't just go to his room, but the thought of Gina being overly touchy with Luigi left a bitter taste in his mouth. Hey, Tony, Milo greeted as soon as he spotted him. I hope I didn't keep you from anything important. Tony raised an eyebrow. I was about to go to bed. Perfect. Milo grinned, standing up and stretching. I was thinking, since we're both here, why not share a bed? I mean, I promise I don't snore. Tony blinked, staring at him for a moment, unsure if he was joking or not. But the look in Milo's eyes told him it was serious. "I what?" Tony stammered, stepping back. "No, absolutely not." "Oh, come on," Milo said with a grin, taking a few steps closer. "It's just one night. It's not like I'll bite." Tony shot him a deadpan look. "I think I'd rather sleep on the floor." Milo's eyes sparkled with mischief as he leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You're not even curious what it would be like?" Tony stepped back further, annoyed. "I'm sure it's not that exciting." Milo chuckled softly, clearly entertained by Tony's resistance. "You're the one making it awkward, Tony. Relax. It's just sleeping after all." Tony, realizing he wasn't going to win this one easily, put up a final attempt. "I don't care if it's just sleeping. I have boundaries." Milo had an amused expression on his face. "Boundaries? With me? I like a man with boundaries." He stepped even closer, making Tony take another involuntary step back. "But I think I can make you reconsider. You're not as tough as you pretend to be, Tony." "Stop trying, Milo," Tony muttered, his discomfort written all over his face. "You're wasting your time." Before Milo could respond, Luigi's voice rang out from the doorway. "Is there a problem here?" Tony turned to find Luigi standing there, with a glare on his face, pointed directly at Milo. "Luigi, it's nothing," Tony said quickly, trying to brush it off. Milo cut him off with a smile. "I was just offering Tony a little company for the night, but I think he's a little shy." Luigi's eyes flicked to Tony for a split second, his gaze hardening before returning to Milo. "You're being inappropriate, Milo." Milo shrugged, unaffected. "It's just a suggestion." Tony swallowed nervously, trying not to look at Luigi's expression. He could feel the tension between the two men building. He could hear Luigi taking in a deep breath to calm himself down, and he suddenly regretted walking into the room. "Tony doesn't need your suggestions," Luigi said, his voice calm but firm. "You'll sleep in your own room, Milo." Tony shot Luigi a grateful glance, but quickly turned his attention back to Milo. "See? You heard the man." Milo, clearly entertained by the entire situation, raised his hands in mock surrender. Fine. No need to get all possessive, Luigi." "Good," Luigi replied, his tone suddenly low and dangerous. "And if you bother Tony again, I'll make sure it's a very uncomfortable night for you." Milo raised his eyebrows, still looking amused. Luigi simply gave him a look that made the room feel a few degrees cooler, making Milo quickly walk into the guest room provided for him. "Good night, Tony," Luigi said, his voice softening as he stepped closer to him. "And remember, you have my permission to kick Milo if he starts anything." Tony gave a small, awkward nod. "Thanks, Luigi." But just as he thought the situation was over, Luigi leaned in, his lips grazing Tony's ear as he whispered, "I'll be watching, Tony. And just so you know, you're very tempting." Tony shivered involuntarily, his heart racing. "You're impossible." Luigi chuckled softly. "I know." Tony quickly turned away and made his way to his bedroom, doing his best to ignore his heart racing in his chest. He closed the door behind him, pressing his back against it for a moment as he tried to calm his nerves. The morning after Milo and Gino left, the house finally returned to its usual state. Sophia was in school, and without the cooks, the place felt empty with just Tony and Luigi around. Tony had barely finished making a cup of coffee when Luigi entered the kitchen. "Good morning, Tony," Luigi greeted. Tony glanced up from his coffee cup, trying to ignore the flutter in his chest. "Morning," he muttered, pretending to focus on stirring his drink. Luigi didn't move from the doorway, his gaze fixed on Tony, studying him intently. It felt like Luigi was always watching him, like a predator observing its prey. "You looked nice last night," Luigi said, his words low, the hint of something more dangerous lingering in his tone. "I like the way you handled Milo." Tony gave a half-smile, trying to act like his stomach didn't just do backflips from the compliment. "I just told him to stop being creepy." Luigi smirked, walking closer. "You were more than just sassy. You were confident, and I like that." Tony rolled his eyes, but couldn't help the small, nervous laugh that escaped his lips. "Yeah, well, I don't have time for people who think they can flirt their way into my personal space." "I'm sure." Luigi was now standing right next to him, a bit too close for comfort. Tony's heartbeat quickened. He had no idea why being this close to Luigi made him feel so unsettled, but he didn't want to admit it. Luigi leaned down, whispering, "I've always preferred things that are difficult to have." Before Tony could respond, Luigi backed him up against the kitchen island. He was close enough that Tony could feel his body heat. "Luigi," Tony warned, though his voice was shaky and barely a whisper, betraying the hint of nervousness mixed with something else, a kind of desire he couldn't quite control. "Stop." Luigi's hand rested on the countertop next to Tony's hip, trapping him with nowhere to go. His gaze was intense, predatory, but there was something else there, something deeper. "Stop," Luigi repeated, his voice teasing. "You like this, Tony?" Tony swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't." "You're lying," Luigi murmured, brushing a stray lock of hair behind Tony's ear. "I've seen the way you look at me, the way you react to me. You don't want me to stop." Tony's body flushed with heat, his mind racing to keep control of the situation. "You're insane," he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Luigi's smirk widened. He took a step closer, his face now inches from Tony's. "Am I?" he murmured. "Or are you just too scared to admit you want me?" Tony froze, feeling the wall behind him press into his back. There was nowhere for him to go now. "Luigi, Tony started, but his words were cut off by the deep, almost predatory laugh that escaped Luigi's lips. "You're not fooling anyone, Tony. I see the way you react when I'm near you," Luigi whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "You can't hide it. Not from me." Tony's chest tightened as he tried to step away to the side, but Luigi's hand shot out, gently but firmly pressing against his chest, keeping him in place. "Do you feel that?" Luigi's voice was almost too smooth. "The way your heart races when I touch you?" Tony's breath hitched, and he hated that he couldn't deny it. This isn't happening," he muttered, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Luigi chuckled again, a low, throaty sound. "It's happening whether you like it to or not." Tony's head was spinning as Luigi's face hovered dangerously close, his lips merely inches away. The intensity of his gaze made Tony's face hot. And just when Tony thought he couldn't take any more of the pressure, Luigi backed off, putting a little distance between them, but not enough to ease the tension that hung in the air. "I'll give you time," Luigi said, his voice low, almost seductive. "But you can't hide forever," he said, before walking away. Tony exhaled shakily, his body still pressed against the countertop. After Luigi was out of sight, his knees gave away, and he slid down to the ground. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the fact that he could barely resist Luigi's advances, or the terrifying thought that, at some point, he might not want to. One day, Tony was in the kitchen, busy preparing breakfast, when the sound of footsteps caught his attention. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat as Luigi entered the room. "Good morning," Luigi said, his deep voice as commanding as ever. He looked every inch the Mafia boss today, dressed in a dark, tailored suit. "Morning," Tony replied, trying his best to keep his voice steady. "I need to talk to you," Luigi said, his tone quieter now, more serious. Tony furrowed his eyebrows as he turned to face him. "What's up?" Luigi's gaze softened slightly. "I'm going on a mission. I'll be gone for a week." Tony's heart immediately skipped, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "A week? Yeah, I know it's short notice, but things need to be handled." Luigi's eyes softened just a fraction, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I need you to look after Sophia while I'm gone. I trust you more than anyone with her." Tony swallowed hard, trying to ignore the panic that started to build in his chest. "Of course, I'll take care of her." Luigi nodded and walked closer. When he reached Tony, he placed a hand on his shoulder before bringing him into a hug. Tony didn't resist, he didn't want to. "You'll be fine, Tony," he said softly, his voice almost tender. "I'll be back soon. Don't worry about anything." Tony nodded, though inside his mind was racing. "Okay, just be careful, all right?" Luigi smirked slightly, pulling away from the hug, his thumb brushing against the back of Tony's neck. "You really do care, don't you?" Tony froze. He quickly stepped back, trying to hide the flutter in his chest. "It's not like that, Luigi." Luigi's eyes narrowed. "Sure, Tony. Whatever you say." He leaned in, his lips brushing against Tony's ear just enough to make his body tense. "Just know you're always on my mind. I'll be back before you know it." Tony's mind was a mess. His stomach twisted as he tried to push the strange, fluttering feeling in his chest away. But he couldn't. "Take care of yourself," Tony finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. Luigi nodded, giving him one last look before turning on his heel and heading toward the door, with his men wearing black suits behind him. "I'll see you soon, Tony." Tony watched as Luigi left. He stood there for a moment. He knew this was his life now, the world of danger, uncertainty, and constant fear that came with being involved with a man like Luigi. The days passed slowly. Sophia was her usual self, distracting Tony with her endless questions and her enthusiasm for everything around her. But despite the distraction, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something was wrong. The first night without Luigi was the hardest. Tony had finished tucking Sophia in a bed. Then he went to his own room, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept drifting back to the last conversation he had with Luigi. The way he had spoken to him, the warmth in his touch, the way his presence made everything seem Right. He hated how much he missed Luigi. How much he longed for his touch, his voice, the way Luigi could make him feel in ways Tony has never felt. The next day, there were no messages, no calls, no check-ins. Tony tried not to worry, but he would check his phone every few minutes, hoping for a message, a sign that Luigi was all right. But there was nothing. On the fourth day, Tony received a call from one of Luigi's men, informing him that the mission was going as planned. But even that brief interaction didn't ease the anxiety growing in him. And also, he wanted to hear from Luigi himself. By the time the fifth day arrived, Tony couldn't take it anymore. He tried to go about his day, taking care of Sophia, doing his regular routine, but everything felt wrong. He couldn't stop thinking about Luigi. He missed him more than he ever thought possible. The house felt too big without him. That night, Tony sat in the living room, his phone in hand, waiting. He couldn't stop the thoughts racing through his mind. What if something had gone wrong? What if Luigi wasn't coming back? What if this was the last time he ever saw him? The thought made his heart ache in a way he couldn't explain. He hated this. He hated feeling so helpless, so vulnerable. That's when it hit him. He loved him. The realization hit Tony like a train, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He leaned back against the couch, his chest tight, his heart pounding in his ears. He loved Luigi. He loved him in a way that terrified him. He loved the way Luigi made him feel safe, even in the most dangerous situations. He loved the way he could be cold and ruthless one moment and gentle the next. He loved the way his presence seemed to make everything feel like it was supposed to be. But he also feared the world that Luigi lived in, a world of violence and power, a world that Tony had no place in. He wasn't strong enough to survive in it. And yet, despite all his fear that made his chest tighten, he couldn't deny the truth. He loved Luigi. The next morning, as the sixth day passed, Tony found himself pacing the house, unable to sit still. His mind kept returning to that one thought. What if something happened to him? He couldn't bring himself to fall asleep that night. For days later, just as Tony was beginning to lose hope, the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted him from his thoughts. His heart skipped, and without thinking, he rushed to the window. The black car that belonged to Luigi was parked in the driveway, and Tony's heart beat wildly in his chest. Luigi was home. He quickly tried to smooth out his clothes. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or angry at him for staying away longer than promised. Sophia, of course, was already at the door, her face lighting up with excitement as the door swung open. "Papa!" she screamed, running toward Luigi. Luigi stepped out of the car. He looked every bit the dangerous man Tony had come to know. His eyes looked tired but still filled with intensity. Sophia launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "I missed you, Papa." Luigi chuckled, lifting her up. "I missed you too, Princess." He then glanced over at Tony, his gaze intense. Tony stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried not to show how much he had missed him, how much he had worried. The silence between them felt thick, like something was just on the edge of being said, but neither of them wanted to break it. "Tony," Luigi said, his voice soft. "You didn't think I'd be gone forever, did you?" Tony couldn't help the frustration that bubbled up inside him. "You said you'd be back in a week, not almost two." His voice was quieter than he intended, but still sharp. Luigi raised an eyebrow, walking toward Tony. "You worried about me?" Tony swallowed, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite control. "I wasn't worried," he muttered, but his voice faltered. "I just didn't like being kept in the dark." Luigi's lips curled into that mischievous smirk that always sent a rush of heat to Tony's face. "You don't need to worry about me. I can handle myself." But Tony's eyes immediately went to his arms, scanning them for any signs of injury. His gaze flicked to his face, his hands, looking for any indication of bruises or marks that might suggest he had been hurt. Luigi followed his gaze, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Looking for bruises?" Tony froze, realizing he had been caught staring. He trailed off, his heart hammering in his chest. "I just want to make sure you're all right." Luigi chuckled darkly, his tone turning low and dangerous. "You really care, don't you?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming as he backed Tony against the wall, trapping him in place. Tony's breath hitched as Luigi's body closed the distance between them. His heart raced in his chest, his palms suddenly clammy. He wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Luigi tilted Tony's head back slightly, his face inches from Tony's. "I told you, Tony, you don't need to worry. I can handle myself." "But—" He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against Tony's ear. "I think you miss me more than you're letting on." Tony's body stiffened, his mind screaming at him to pull away, or at least push Luigi off him. But instead, his body betrayed him. "I didn't miss you. Tony lied, his voice shaking slightly. Sure you didn't. And before Tony could react, Luigi pressed his lips firmly to his, kissing him deeply, possessively. Tony's heart was pounding, his mind a mess as Luigi kissed him with that same intensity that Tony had come to crave. For a moment, Tony didn't care that they were standing in the hallway of the house, that Sophia was only a few feet away, playing with her toys. All he could focus on was the feeling of Luigi's lips against his, the way his body seemed to fit perfectly against his own. Sophia, oblivious to the intensity of the moment, suddenly clapped her hands together in excitement. Yay! Papa and Tony are kissing, she cheered. Both of them froze. Tony pulled back from the kiss, his cheeks hot and his heart still racing. He looked down at Sophia, who was beaming with a bright smile, clearly delighted by the display. Luigi chuckled darkly, his gaze never leaving Tony's flushed face. Looks like our little princess is happy, he murmured, his lips curling into a smug grin. Tony quickly stepped away from Luigi, trying to regain a little composure. He ran a hand through his hair, his face still burning. I didn't expect that, he muttered, his voice shaky. Luigi raised an eyebrow. What did you expect, Tony? He took a step closer, his presence still dominant, still commanding. That I come home and act like nothing is happening between us? Tony opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. His emotions were a mess. He was angry that Luigi had been gone for so long, worried about him, but at the same time, he couldn't deny the attraction, the pull he felt toward him. Sophia giggled. I like it when you two kiss. You should do it more. Tony shot her a quick glance, trying to mask his embarrassment. Sophia, we're just... He stumbled over his words, not knowing how to explain the situation. Luigi chuckled softly, the sound comforting. He leaned down, brushing his. Luigi chuckled softly, the sound comforting. He leaned down, brushing his lips against Tony's ear, his breath warm against his skin. Don't worry, Tony. I'll take care of everything. You don't need to pretend with me. Tony's heart skipped a beat at his words. In that moment, all he could think about was how badly he wanted him, how badly he needed him. Sophia tugged at Tony's sleeve, drawing his attention away from Luigi. Are you two going to play with me now? She asked eagerly, her innocent smile breaking through the tension in the room. Of course, sweetie. Let's go play. Tony took her hand and led her to the living room. But even as they moved to the living room, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he knew that his feelings for Luigi were only getting stronger. Tony had just finished tucking Sophia into bed. He descended down the stairs and found Luigi leaning against the kitchen counter. You're hovering again, Tony said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. Luigi chuckled, pouring himself a glass of wine. Maybe I just enjoy your company. Yeah, sure, Tony rolled his eyes. What do you want now, boss man? A date. Tony froze. Excuse me? A date, Luigi repeated, stepping closer. You mean somewhere nice? No, Sophia, no interruptions. Tony narrowed his eyes. Why do I feel like this is another one of your schemes? Luigi leaned in. No schemes. I want to spend time with you. Tony's heart skipped. You're serious? Always, Luigi replied, his voice soft but firm. Tony hesitated, but the sincerity in Luigi's eyes made it impossible to turn him down. Fine. One date. But if you pull any mafia tricks, I'm walking. Luigi grinned, looking truly happy. Deal. The following day, Tony found himself pacing his room. It wasn't like this was his first time going out with someone, but something about Luigi made him extra nervous. He finally settled on a simple outfit, nothing too fancy, but still nice enough for whatever Luigi had planned. When he came downstairs, Luigi was waiting, as handsome as ever. Looking good, Luigi teased, his gaze lingering a little too long. Tony's cheeks flushed. You too, he replied simply. Sophia was in school, so they had limited time before they had to pick her up. Luigi was the one driving this time. He wanted it to be just the two of them, so he didn't request for a driver. Where are we going? Tony asked, curious. You'll see, Luigi replied with a smile. The car eventually pulled up to a cafe by a quiet river. The place had an old charm, with iron chairs and tables set under a canopy of vines. Tony raised an eyebrow. This is unexpected. Luigi chuckled, leading him inside. Not everything in my life is grand, Tony. I thought you liked something more intimate. Tony had to admit he did. The cafe was warm and welcoming, with the scent of fresh coffee and pastries filling the air. They settled into a table by the window, the river creating a serene backdrop. As they waited for their orders, Luigi leaned back in his chair, studying Tony. Can I ask you something? Luigi began, his voice quieter than usual. Tony tensed. Depends on what it is. Luigi smiled faintly. Do you ever wonder why Sophia is my only child? Tony blinked at the unexpected question. I mean, I just assumed you hadn't found the right person to settle down with. Luigi nodded slowly. In a way, you're right. Sophia isn't a traditional child. She was born through surrogacy. Tony's eyes widened. Oh, I didn't know that. Luigi's gaze softened as he looked out the window. I never thought I'd be the kind of man to have a family. My life is complicated, to say the least. But when Sophia came into my life, everything changed. She gave me purpose. Tony swallowed hard, the vulnerability in Luigi's voice catching him off guard. I never thought I'd fall in love, either, Luigi continued, turning his attention back to Tony. But then you walked into my life with all your sass and fire, and suddenly, everything felt possible again. Tony's cheeks burned, his heart racing. You can't just say stuff like that, he muttered, looking away. Why not? Luigi teased, leaning forward. Does it make you uncomfortable, Tony, knowing how much you mean to me? Yes, Tony blurted before adding. I mean, no, I don't know. Luigi chuckled, clearly enjoying Tony's flustered state. After their meal, they drove back to Sophia's school. Tony was quiet for most of the drive, Luigi's words replaying in his mind. When they arrived, Sophia ran to them with her usual enthusiasm, holding up a new drawing. Look, Papa! Look, Tony, she exclaimed, showing off a picture of the three of them holding hands under a rainbow. Tony felt his chest tighten as he took the drawing. It was simple, innocent, but it spoke volumes. Beautiful work, Sophia, Luigi said, ruffling her hair. Tony smiled softly, carefully folding the drawing to keep it safe. The drive home was filled with Sophia's cheerful chatter, but Tony barely heard her. He kept glancing at Luigi, at Sophia, at the picture tucked into his pocket. By the time they pulled into the driveway, the realization had settled in his heart. This was where he belonged. He wanted to be part of their lives, not just as Sophia's nanny, but as something more. As they stepped inside, Luigi caught Tony's arm, his gaze searching. You okay? Tony looked at him, his heart full. Yeah, he said softly, a small smile playing at his lips. I'm more than okay. Luigi's expression softened, and for once, he didn't push or tease. He just smiled back, his hand lingering on Tony's arm. And in that moment, Tony knew he had found his home.